I've been writing a book on each presidential election as it takes place since 1992, and I've also written on 1980 and 1948 and some other election-related books. So it's been the better part of my professional career, really. I was always very interested in it from the time I was a little kid. I began paying attention to the national conventions when I was 10 and stayed up late, got special dispensation from my folks to stay up and watch some late night conventions, and went to graduate school with the intention of studying American politics, and did that. And my dissertation advisor was at that time really focused on presidential nominations. And so I got very interested in that and began writing about presidential nominations, and it's just gone from there. The reason that this week has really captured people's attention is that it is very unusual. It's not unprecedented, but there have only been really 3 cases since World War II in which a president who was eligible to run for re-election decided not to do it, and decided not to do it after votes had already started to be cast in primaries, or in President Biden's case, all of that votes had been cast in the primaries. That was all done. And so you have to go back to 1968 to find an example of it with Lyndon Johnson. There was one other case in 1952 with Harry Truman. But other than that, when presidents can run for re-election, they do. Things come very quickly and they go very quickly. So it's been less than 2 weeks since we had an attempted assassination of a presidential candidate, and we've already moved on. We're now talking about President Biden having chosen not to run for re-election. A week from now, that's going to be old news. It may be old news already. So that's very different from the past, where you would have a much slower process of sort of getting the news out and processing the news. So President Biden's decision is really different in some important respects from the previous examples. One of the differences is that it came much later than the other cases. President Johnson announced that he was stepping out of the Democratic race for the nomination on March 31st. Harry Truman did the same thing on March 29th, and the state of New Hampshire had voted. They had their primary already, but not much else had happened at that point in the race, because things were much slower developing than most of the primaries were late in the season. So New Hampshire happens, they drop out, and the Democrats have the entire rest of the primary season and the convention, many months, to decide who their nominee is going to be and for other candidates to emerge and make a run for it. In this case, President Biden, obviously withdrew much later. He withdrew after all the primaries were done, all the delegates were selected. We were about less than 4 weeks from the opening of the Democratic National Convention, and so the time frame is very different. The other thing that's different is that if you look at the other 2 cases, Truman in 1952 and Johnson in 1968, there's a lot of evidence that they were thinking about this for some time, even though they announced in March. Truman apparently told his staff in November of 1951 that he was not planning to seek re-election. Johnson had some remarks prepared several months earlier to the effect that he was not going to run for re-election. And it's pretty clear that although they were both under a lot of political pressure in the primaries, the decision was really theirs. They were ready to leave the White House in a lot of ways. And in President Biden's case, it seems pretty apparent that the decision to withdraw was not something that really came from him. He made that decision, but in a lot of ways, there was pressure from within the party that resulted in the decision. And if you look at President Biden's speech on national television explaining his decision, or at least kind of fleshing it out a bit, it's not really clear that he accepts the premise behind which the pressure was being generated. He said repeatedly he felt he could have done a good job in the second term. He felt confident that he could win. And the pressure that was coming on him to drop out was from folks who had concluded that those things were not necessarily the case. And so I think you have a more externally generated decision in this case than in the other cases. So what I would be looking for in the Democratic convention, actually, despite all of the hubbub, despite the massive change in the candidates, what I would be looking for at this point is a convention that's pretty much like every other convention these days. I think there was a brief moment when you could imagine that maybe Democrats would decide that they wanted to open things up and have a really competitive process over the next a few weeks, and then maybe a competitive, what we call open convention. But pretty clearly the decision has been made at this point not to do that. The party has more or less coalesced behind Kamala Harris. And so it's, I think, likely to be kind of a coronation the way most conventions are, pretty much every convention since 1976. Obviously, there are a lot of things that have changed in the race. There have been a lot of exciting moments, a lot of scary moments, a lot of moments that nobody really expected or few people expected. And so the question is, how do you handle this? You know, if you're trying to analyze it, or if you're trying to analyze it a few months from now, how would you look at it? And I think, ironically, one of the things I would say at this point is that my takeaway at the moment would be that the political forces today are so dug in that even massive events don't really shift the outlook all that much. I think, I do think that former President Trump will face a tougher race. I think it actually could go either way at this point. I think that was not the case 3 weeks ago. I think that he was headed toward probably defeating President Biden, but that was unusual. That was because of this very unusual sort of moment when you had a president who even his own party was saying may not be up to the job. Once you take that out and you kind of reset with a candidate about whom that can't be said, I think things are kind of reverting to normal, which is to say we live in a 50-50 country. And I think at the end of the day, it's going to probably be a pretty close election. I think we may not have a winner right away, no matter who seems to be ahead. I think there's a very good likelihood that that there's going to be a continued contest for a while, and so we're sort of back to where we were 6 months ago, a year ago, 4 years ago, and 8 years ago.